Welcome back to The Explainer. So, have you ever just stopped and looked at a giant oak tree or, even just that little potted fern sitting on your desk and wondered, how exactly is this thing powering its life? I mean, we know animals have to actively eat food and constantly breathe in oxygen just to survive, but a plant, it kind of just sits there. Yet deep inside its leaves, its stems, and its roots, there is this massive, highly coordinated cellular factory just humming away. It's constantly breaking down molecules to generate the sheer amount of energy required to grow, transport nutrients, and reproduce. So today, we're demystifying cellular respiration. We're going to reveal exactly how plants extract all that energy.
Okay, let's dive into this. The very first question we have to ask, and it sounds almost too simple, is do plants actually breathe? It sounds like a total beginner question, right? But the answer actually opens up a whole new level of understanding biology. You see, the process of breathing, literally just exchanging gases, is intimately, essentially connected to the process of releasing energy from food. Plants need energy just as much as we do, and getting that energy, well, it absolutely requires oxygen.
To make sense of exactly how they pull this off, here is our roadmap for today. First, do plants breathe? Then we'll hit glycolysis, move on to fermentation, the Krebs cycle, the ETS, and finally, we'll tally up the balance sheet. All right, Section 1. Do plants breathe? The macro view.
When we typically think of breathing, we immediately picture lungs. But surprisingly, plants have absolutely zero specialized respiratory organs. None. Instead, they rely on these tiny little openings called stomata on their leaves and lenticels on their stems. So how do they get along without a central breathing system to pump things around? Well, basically, every single plant part takes care of its own gas exchange needs. There isn't much gas being transported from one part to another. Plus, let's be honest, their energy demands are way lower than, say, a running animal. Even in those thick woody stems you see, the living cells are organized in very thin layers just beneath the bark. What that means is almost every living cell in a plant is located pretty darn close to the surface, surrounded by this massive, interconnected network of air spaces.
So, the plant gets its oxygen. Awesome. But what does it actually do with it? Well, it uses it to make ATP. You probably already know ATP as the energy currency of the cell. Think about it. If a plant just burned its food all at once, in one big flash, all that energy would literally just be lost as heat. Useless. Instead, their strategy is incredibly elegant and efficient. They break down glucose step by step, carefully capturing the released energy to synthesize ATP. Whenever the cell needs to pay for any kind of activity, it just spends this ATP currency. Moving right along to Section 2, glycolysis, splitting the sugar. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this 10-step process, often called the EMP pathway, doesn't even require oxygen. It's a completely universal process found in every single living organism on Earth. The whole cycle kicks off with a 6-carbon glucose molecule. But notice how the cell actually has to invest a couple of ATP molecules right at the start. You literally have to spend money to make money. This initial investment is what splits that glucose into 2 3-carbon molecules, which are then eventually converted into pyruvic acid. So, what exactly did our cellular factory produce during this first shift? From just that one single glucose molecule, our glycolysis outputs are 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, a net profit of 2 ATP, because remember, we spent some early on, and a molecule called NADH, which is basically a carrier holding high-energy electrons. Pyruvic acid is the absolute star of the show here. It's just sitting there on the assembly line waiting for its next destination, which depends entirely on exactly what the cell needs in that moment.
Section 3. Fermentation. Life without oxygen.
Okay, so our pyruvic acid has basically hit a fork in the road. Under anaerobic conditions, meaning no oxygen available, the cell has to shift into fermentation, which is an incomplete oxidation. But if oxygen is present, the cell gets to proceed to the Krebs cycle for complete oxidation. Let's take a quick look at that anaerobic backup plan first. Fermentation will definitely get the cell out of a jam if the power goes out, but it is far from ideal. It only allows for a partial breakdown of the glucose, yielding lactic acid or, in organisms like yeast, ethanol and CO2. Crucially, and this is a big deal, it releases less than 7% of the energy locked in that original glucose molecule. That's a terrible return on investment. Furthermore, the byproducts themselves are actually hazardous. For example, yeasts will quite literally poison themselves to death when the concentration of the alcohol they're producing hits about 13%. Now for Section 4, the Krebs cycle, the powerhouse.
Clearly, if we want to get the big energy payout, we need oxygen. Now, so we don't get totally lost inside this massive mitochondrial factory, let's clearly signpost the two massive events coming up. Event number 1, the complete oxidation of pyruvate by systematically removing its hydrogen atoms. This happens deep inside the fluid of the mitochondrial matrix. Event number 2, taking the electrons from those stripped hydrogen atoms and passing them over to oxygen to synthesize a massive amount of ATP. That second part takes place right on the inner mitochondrial membrane. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how that happens. Here in the Krebs cycle, the pyruvate from our earlier steps is converted into a 2-carbon molecule called Acetyl CoA, and that enters this continuously spinning cyclic pathway. As the cycle turns, it systematically dismantles the molecule, snapping off carbons and releasing them as CO2, which the plant will eventually just release into the air. But look closely at what it's extracting. It's grabbing incredibly valuable high-energy hydrogen equivalents and loading them onto carriers called NADH and FADH2. Which brings us to Section 5, the Electron Transport System, or ETS.
I want you to think of the ETS like a bank. We are finally cashing in all those NADH and FADH2 carriers we've been saving up on the assembly line. These carriers drop off and pass their electrons through a series of complex proteins. As the electrons essentially bounce down this chain, their energy is cleverly used to pump protons across the membrane, building up a huge gradient. Finally, those protons rush back through a highly specialized molecular turbine called ATP synthase, literally synthesizing our ATP currency.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is, where does oxygen actually fit into all this? Although this entire aerobic process strictly requires oxygen, the crazy thing is oxygen only makes its appearance at the very terminal stage. It acts as the final hydrogen acceptor. It basically just sits at the very end of the ETS chain, acting like a super powerful magnet, pulling the electrons down the line and combining with them, and a few protons, to form perfectly harmless water. Without that oxygen magnet sitting at the end, the whole assembly line backs up and completely grinds to a halt.
Section 6, the respiratory balance sheet. Let's look at the profits. 38. That is the theoretical net gain of ATP molecules produced from a single, solitary molecule of glucose during aerobic respiration. Remember a few minutes ago when we saw that fermentation only gave us a measly net gain of 2? Yeah. By utilizing oxygen, the mitochondrial factory is just incredibly efficient, extracting a massive 38 ATP to power the plant's growth, repair, and survival.
Now, before we wrap this up, we actually need to correct a pretty common misconception. We just spent this entire explainer watching a glucose molecule get broken down, piece by piece. That's a catabolic process. But in reality, the respiratory pathway is an amphibolic pathway, which is a fancy way of saying it involves both breaking things down and building things up. In a living, breathing plant, intermediates from glycolysis and the Krebs cycle are constantly being pulled off the assembly line to synthesize fats and proteins. It's not a one-way street. It's a highly dynamic two-way street that forms the absolute core of the cell's metabolism.
Which brings us to our final thought for today. We focused really heavily on glucose today, but plants, and actually all organisms, can use fats or proteins as their respiratory fuel too. When they do, the ratio of CO2 they release compared to the oxygen they consume actually changes. This specific ratio is called the respiratory quotient, or RQ. And it begs a really fascinating question. How does the actual type of food an organism burns fundamentally change the math of its own metabolism? It's just a great reminder that this cellular factory is incredibly adaptable, constantly tweaking its own chemistry based on exactly what fuel is available. Keep that in mind next time you look at that quiet, stationary little plant on your desk. It is a literal metabolic powerhouse. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.